Hello, everyone. Good morning to those in the Philippines or in Asia, if it's morning for you. And then I think we may have some people who are calling in from other countries. So good afternoon or good evening to you. Welcome to our session for today. We are going to talk about women at work and, of course, making sure that we share tips for our HR professionals and for anyone who is in the workplace or will be part of the workplace in the future. Before we begin, let's make sure we know our ground rules. So please, if you are here, try to engage so you can learn. The chat box is open. It would be great if you can share your insights as we go through the day. And of course, please listen to understand. Let's create a safe space for everyone here to learn and to explore. I'll introduce myself since I think we have some people here who are joining in for the first time. I'm Elizha Corpus. You can call me Elizha. And my firm is very creatively called Elizha Corpus Consulting. That's just my name. We focus on culture transformation, leadership development, and diversity, equity, and inclusion. My clients are here in the Philippines and international as well. So I'm very excited to get to share a lot of our insights with you today. We've been doing free webinars since 2020, almost every month. And then for this year, we decided that we would do HR spotlights. Every month, we'll select a topic or a research or a function of HR, and we'll deep dive into it. I did my master's in Michigan State University, so undergrad here in the Philippines in UP Diliman, but I did my master's in Human Resources and Labor Relations abroad. I also worked with Microsoft in their headquarters right after doing my master's. So a lot of the things that I'm able to share with my participants here in the Philippines, I also learned from my time abroad and from spending my time with different clients, different employees globally. So that's something I love doing and sharing with all of you. I hope we can get to know each other more as we go through our session today and maybe even in future sessions. To start getting to know each other better, I'd love to know, why are you all here today? So what is it about gender bias that you'd like to understand, or what makes it interesting for you in the role that you are in? So please, let's go to Mentimeter. The link to the Mentimeter is in the chat, or you could also go to www.menti.com and then use the code 31881901. Earlier, some people already started filling out our Mentimeter, so let's go and take a look at some of their answers. All right, let's see here. So it looks like people here, they want to understand gender bias because it will guide them towards inclusivity. That's great that you're thinking about inclusion overall. Also, gender bias is mostly found in cultural education and the economy, and it's something that oppresses women. So I'm glad that you're also seeing that beyond the workplace, this is a relevant topic for education, economy, maybe even society as a whole. Right? Let's see, what else are our people saying here? What makes it important for you in your role? Especially for the people here who are working in organizations or working with organizations. What makes it important for you to understand gender bias? Okay, so understanding gender bias will enable us to treat everyone equal and help break stereotypes. That's great. I know that a lot of us, most of us here today, are actually individual contributors in organizations. So it's great to see that a lot of you are interested in that. So let's go ahead and think about, what is it that we are going to do during our time together today? I'm glad that you want to have an understanding of gender bias. So of course, let's ground all of that in what is the state of gender and women in the workplace, especially in the Philippines. Let's look at what are the current data or statistics that we can learn from. And then of course, let's identify those gender biases that are still holding women back at work. What are these biases that we face? And most important, let's learn about some actionable strategies that HR professionals, leaders, future professionals of all gender, what can we do to promote work that is inclusive for all? So these are the three different things that we are going to get done. We have to put some sort of context into why we are here. So let's talk about why are we here to talk about gender at work. All right, so in 2022, the World Economic Forum, they released their Global Gender Gap Report. This is something that they do every year. And according to their latest report, it will take around 132 years to close the gender gap worldwide. I don't know about you, but 132 years seems like a very long time. I don't even think I'll be around by then to see that happen. So don't get us wrong, the report does say there's progress that we've been seeing. For example, we know that the share of women in leadership positions that increased from 2016 to 2022. So there's been about a 36.9% increase. So that's a good statistic to take note of. We also know, for example, that globally, the share of women in government positions that nearly doubled between 2006 and 2022. So it seems like we have more women now who actually have the capability to create laws, policies that will help with gender parity and inclusion. However, we cannot stop there knowing that these things are happening because there are so many different things that are happening right now affecting or influencing gender parity. For example, we had COVID, or we still have COVID, right? But what the International Labor Organization is saying is that COVID affected women more compared to men. For example, about 5% of employed women lost their jobs compared with only 3.9% of men who are employed who lost their jobs. And then we also know, for example, that from comparing the years 2021 to 2022, it seems like 4% women were 4% more likely to report that they are stressed. So during the pandemic years, when we were at the height of COVID, it was reported that women experienced that stress more. So what we're learning from here is there is still a lot that we need to do to be able to have that gender parity worldwide. But I'm sure you're asking, for HR, what makes this important? So why is it an HR spotlight if it's just about gender? So Gartner, one of the research and consulting firms worldwide, in 2022, they found that about 35% of HR leaders, they said that DEI is a top priority for 2022. DEI is diversity, equity, and inclusion. And then, going further in 2023, in their latest report, it seems like DEI expectations are being incorporated in leadership and management. What we're seeing is that in terms of the new approaches for what's expected from leaders and managers, people want them to create spaces that are safe for self-expression, no matter what gender you might be. They want leaders and managers to be able to individualize their approaches so that they can address the different life needs and stages of their employees. So as we can see here, people want DEI to really be institutionalized in their organizations. They want leaders to be involved. They want leaders to take note that this is something they find to be essential in organizations. Again, this is important for HR professionals because we are directly involved in finding ways to create these inclusive spaces in our organizations. let's go to the Philippines and try to figure out why it matters for us. If you look at the data, the Philippines is actually doing pretty well. We rank 19th globally in terms of gender parity. If you look at the East Asia and the Pacific region, we're actually number 2, second to New Zealand. So pretty good, right? If we look at the numbers. But there are also aspects that I think we have to pay close attention to. For example, the World Economic Forum report says that in terms of educational attainment, it seems like there is a decrease in the rate of girls who are getting into primary education. So that's something that we should be aware of, because that means maybe in the future we'll have that shortage of women because they're not going into primary education. So yes, there's good progress because we are ranking pretty high, but there's a lot that we can do. I see a question in the chat. Yes, DEI is diversity, equity, and inclusion. So thanks for clarifying that. Also, so in the Philippines, even though there are different policies that are women-friendly, we do have laws that have been passed that are for women and protecting women. But these are still the headlines that we sometimes see in the news. For example, past president and his different antics when it comes to dealing with and interacting with women. In 2020, at the height of COVID, we saw news about the PhilHealth executive who got a lap dance for his birthday in the office. 2021, we saw those posts about Canon choosing only men as their ambassadors. And then very recently, just I think this month, we saw that for a branch of the DOST, so that's what the National Academy of Science and Technology is, so they're under DOST. The current president chose the new council and all men, right? So in the Philippines, what I hope we're taking away from this is thinking about gender equality is still very important in the Philippines. We're not there yet in terms of what we have to be doing. There are still behaviors and beliefs that we must try to shift so we can create a truly inclusive country. And with all of that, to be able to start paying attention to all these things, of course, we have to understand first, what are these barriers? We are very lucky because today we have 2 authors who are calling in from the US. It's nighttime for them, but they are calling in to join us. They will be sharing with us some insights from their upcoming book on the gender biases that are still holding women back at work. So everyone, what we'll do is we are going to welcome our authors and then they'll join us in our conversation. Our first guest speaker is Amy. So Amy Dale, PhD, is an award-winning information technology leader and gender equity researcher who has authored numerous scholarly journal articles and book chapters. Her writing has also appeared in Harvard Business Review, Fast Company, and Miss Magazine. Glass Walls is her first book. She is also a sought-after speaker, consultant, and lawsuit expert witness. She resides in Pennsylvania. So everyone, please give a round of applause and say hi to Dr. Amy Dale. Hi, Amy.
Hi, it's so nice to be here.
Hi.
All right. So Amy will join us in our conversation. We also have here with us Leanne 𝗔𝗵𝗵𝗵𝗹. So Leanne 𝗔𝗵𝗵𝗵𝗵, PhD, is Acting Dean and Associate Professor of Intercultural Education in the Cook School of Intercultural Studies at Biola University in California. She is the author of a book exploring women in the mission of the church. She has also written many scholarly articles related to gender bias, and her work has been published in Harvard Business Review and Fast Company. Prior to moving to California, she worked in Western Europe for many years. So everyone, please, let's all welcome Leanne. Hi, Leanne.
Hi, so happy to be here with you all.
Okay, so let me just fix up our screen here so we have our speakers pinned, and then we are going to start our conversation. Okay. So Amy, Leanne, welcome. You're with mostly Filipino audience here, and we're so happy to have you with us in our, this is Thursday morning for all of us here. So maybe before we get started, tell us a little bit about yourself. How did you get started writing about women and researching gender bias?
Yeah, so I'll go ahead and go first. Thank you, Elizha. Thank you for having us. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you're at. So to give you a little bit of background about myself, I work in the field of information technology in higher education. And when I went to college, I studied computer science. And as you may know, computer science and information technology are male-dominated fields. And while I was in college, though, even though I was one of just a few women in each of my classes, I did really well. And I didn't actually perceive any barriers due to my gender. I got all A's, I did well in my class coursework, I finished college in 3 years, and I went on into the workforce. But after I got into the workforce, that's when I started to feel or sense or notice some strange things happening. I was doing well in my roles, but I was also experiencing these unexplainable problems. And so to give you an example, to learn, one of the things that happened was to learn how to be a leader, I was watching the men that were working around me and my male bosses. And I quickly found out, though, that my leadership wasn't accepted in the same way that theirs was. And to give you a quick example, I would watch them, the men, be authoritative when a decision needed to be made and there wasn't consensus. What I saw was when they were decisive, they maintained or increased the level of respect that others had for them. But early on, when I tried that same approach, I remember one meeting very clearly where there was no consensus at the end of the meeting. And so I announced a direction, I announced a decision. But I found that I had lost points with my staff by exerting my authority. But I also knew that I couldn't be tentative and I couldn't be indecisive, or I would be seen as not competent. So I spent years watching the men around me, and I also was a hard worker, and everybody knew I was a hard worker. But I didn't understand, why was I getting a negative result when I was doing exactly what the men were doing? I thought I was at fault. I thought I was doing something wrong. When I started working, nobody told me that I would be perceived differently because I was a woman. I really thought if I just worked hard, that's all I would need to do to earn respect. But that wasn't the case. I was running into barriers that were invisible. I couldn't see them, others couldn't see them. And in fact, a lot of them had no names. Today, the general label that we give to the phenomenon is gender bias. But even many of the barriers, the behaviors that comprise gender bias had no names or labels. Without labels, it's hard to identify the behaviors, and it's hard to talk about them. So about 13 years ago, I started a PhD, a doctorate, and I started this journey to research this bias and barriers towards women in the workplace. And right away, I learned that I wasn't unique and I wasn't alone in my experiences. And as I've worked on this research and talked to other women, it seems that almost everyone has had Me Too moments with gender bias. In 2014, after I finished my PhD, I was lucky enough to meet Dr. Leanne 𝗔𝗵𝗍 at a conference, and we at that point started collaborating on our research. And so I want to turn it over to Leanne, and she can introduce herself and talk about how we've been collaborating.
Sure. Thank you, Amy, and thank you, Elizha, for having us here. So I studied languages and literature as an undergrad student, which was very female dominated, but then I went on to study theology, which is also a very male dominated field. And I was often the only woman in the class, very much like Amy. After that, I went on to work with faith-based nonprofits for about 20 years, living in Western Europe. And I experienced very similar disconnects to the things that Amy had in her role in IT. For example, the hiring requirements were exactly the same for men and women, but once you were in the organization, it became really clear that it was men's career goals and preferences that dominated. And women were sort of seen there as to support the men in their endeavors. And I started noticing that women who'd worked for the organization for a while were kind of cynical and disconnected. They weren't really enjoying their work anymore. And then I'd hear the male leaders say things like, well, there are no good women, or there's no women with leadership ability. But I'd look around and I could see those women all around me. And so I didn't understand why the men couldn't see these gifted and talented women. So I did a practitioner doctorate and I studied the work of the women in the organization, thinking that I could help the men see what was right under their noses and maybe help the women feel like they were seen. But the male leaders weren't terribly impressed. And I began to realize that the problem was a whole lot deeper than I thought. So like Amy, I also did a PhD and I studied women leaders in my field, very much like she did hers. And when we met and compared notes back in 2014 at that conference, we really thought that our women were going to have very different experiences because we were coming from such wildly different industries. But the more we talked and the more we compared notes, the more we realized their experiences were really, really similar. And that led us to conclude that it wasn't about the field or the industry that you were working in, it was about being a woman at work. Mm-hmm. And so that has really launched us on this journey together to comprehensively identify the barriers, to name them, and to make them visible. And we're going to share some of that with you today.
Right. And thank you so much, both of you, for sharing your experiences. I think for a lot of women, we experience these things, but like what you said, until people labeled it or talked about it more openly, it's very hard to even reflect on what those experiences are because you don't know what's happening to you. But I think to your point, right? Nowadays, there's a lot of articles, a lot of posts about women and gender in general, even LGBTQIA+, right? I wonder though, these days, because these are very visible topics, some people might say that we're giving a lot or maybe too much of focus on gender. So what do you think? What's your take on that? Why do we still need to talk about these issues, even if we're already talking about it a lot?
Yeah, so I'll take this question. So we should still be talking about these issues because there is still far too much discrimination against women, LGBTQIA+, and other marginalized groups at work and in society as a whole. So Leanne and I's research focuses on women. And, you know, the title of our book was very deliberate, as you can imagine. It's Glass Walls, Shattering the 6 Gender Bias Barriers Still Holding Women Back at Work. That's why we have the reason we have the word still in our title. These things, unfortunately, have not been eradicated. So in the book, we surface the 6 primary gender bias barriers, like I said, still holding women back. And another thing that Elisha mentioned was that, you know, the ways that we're seeing pushback to gender equality at the highest levels of our government. She talked about the Philippines. We see this similar pushback at different levels of government in the United States. And there's always a group of people, and it's usually men, and usually in the United States, it's usually white men, who think that life was better in the good old days when patriarchy reigned even more supreme. So like when women stayed home and they took care of the men and they took care of the children and they took care of the housework. So while many people today recognize the immense value of women's equality in society and at work, not everyone is on board, and some people actively resist by reinforcing sexism against women, especially at work. So we need to keep talking about this issue until women have reached true equality in all arenas of life.
Mm-hmm. I think, Amy, to your point, I don't want to say it's harder now, but I think it's harder when nowadays people are pushing back more because before it wasn't something we talked about, right? So it was more of an awareness problem. But I think nowadays that more people are aware, then the pushback is about them saying, no more, I don't want to talk about it anymore. So in a sense, that's a different face of the problem that we're seeing. Making it more specific to HR people though, maybe Leanne, you could take this next question. So from an HR perspective, these kinds of behaviors, beliefs, mindsets, attitudes, they seep into work, right? Because we're dealing with humans after all, and they see all these things in the media, in their communities, whatnot. So for people who are in HR, why is this something that we have to pay attention to as we try to create a great workplace for all employees, right? Not just women.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, these things, we talk about them as just being sort of built into the way organizations function. They've seeped in from society and from culture, and organizations were just built this way without even really thinking it through. But when we do look at it closely, we see that the business case is really, really clear. Diverse teams just perform better. I mean, study after study has shown the benefits of having a gender diverse leadership team. Organizations with diverse leadership teams are more profitable, for example. Banks with diverse leadership teams incur fewer fines for misbehavior. In medicine, women surgeons have better outcomes and lower patient death rates. Gender diverse firms perform better at corporate social responsibility too. And they have fewer turnover costs, since replacing an employee, imagine an unhappy woman who leaves because of bias and discrimination, replacing her is really expensive and costly for the organization. And satisfied and happy employees are more productive in the workplace. So what company doesn't want that? But if you're not persuaded by the business case, just think about the moral case, because having women experience work environments as healthy and supportive is just the right thing to do.
Yeah, I think that's the part that we have to continue to talk about, right? Because we could talk about all of these great outcomes, like financial outcomes, also women teams that are more diverse, right, are more creative, they're more innovative, etc. But also it's the right thing to do. So it's something we should all be pushing for. Maybe it might help our audience here to get into that mindset of thinking about the barriers, right? And Amy, if you could please walk us through what are these 6 gender bias walls or glass walls that you and Leanne found out in your book.
So I'll walk you through these. So from this, as you can see, this image is a 6-sided glass wall that women are. We visualize this as women really being stuck inside. You know, you can see, obviously it's transparent, but it's more than a glass ceiling. It's a glass walls that, you know, no matter which way the woman turns, she's running into these, again, invisible barriers. So the first one is male privilege. Male privilege is men's inherent advantage caused by workplace cultures in which men are the leaders, they control the resources, they set the standards, and they assign women to a second-class status. So women are allowed into the organization, they're just assigned into supportive roles or a second-class status. The second one is disproportionate constraints. So again, women are allowed into the organization, but they are constrained in ways that are supportive of men, and they're also held to unequal standards when compared to men. The third wall or barrier is insufficient support. This is women's lack of access to social structures and networks that would help them advance. These are often social structures and networks that are just built into the organization that men have access to, but women do not. The fourth wall is devaluation. Devaluation is attempts to make women seem unimportant and detract from their authority. Fifth wall is hostility. Hostility is an active resistance to women's presence in the workplace, and it usually occurs through things like discrimination, harassment, and retaliation. The goal of hostility is to keep women from stepping out of line and keep them in their supposed place in the gender hierarchy. And then last but not least, the fifth wall is acquiescence. You can see that's at the bottom. Due to the combined weight of all the other barriers, women internalize the obstacles, accept them as valid, and adapt to the limitations. So acquiescence is really it's a barrier, it's a wall, but it's a rational choice that the women are making because of running into all of the other barriers in the workplace and the organization or at their jobs. And like I said, these barriers they're more than a glass ceiling. Yes, the glass ceiling is it's unfortunately still there, all too real, but these are glass walls surrounding women, and no matter which way she turns, these ever-present but invisible barriers impede her.
I actually love that you called it glass walls, because glass ceiling is the more common term that most people would know, right? But that almost seems like you're just encountering barriers as you try to get to the top.
Right.
But with glass walls, it's like it's everywhere. It's something that's very systemic. It seeps into your everyday conversations, even everyday interactions. So I love that you kind of positioned it in that way. So Leanne, maybe you can take the next question. But so now that we know what these glass walls, what these barriers are, where did they come from, right? That's such a big question, but maybe help us to try to understand, why do they exist? Where do these come from? What influences our perceptions and our beliefs that lead to exclusion of women in the workplace?
Mhm. Yeah, well, I mentioned this a little bit before, but these barriers come from culture, they come from tradition, and organizations are basically built by men for men with their life interests in mind, because they were the ones who were creating these organizations that we work in now. Some of these ideas actually developed during the Industrial Revolution, when work in the home got separated and men were assigned to what was called the public sphere and women were assigned to the domestic sphere, or the home. And that was sort of held up as the ideal for everybody. But that sort of way of functioning really only ever applied to the very wealthiest and most privileged people in society, because most of us have to work to make a living, right? And whether it's working the family farm or working in an office, we all have to work. But this underlying belief that somehow women belong at home and men belong at work just persists in many, many of our cultures. And it's damaging to all of us, really, because clearly men are needed at home and women are needed at work. So just consider what we talked about earlier about how much better organizations perform when women are involved there. And so we've got to find ways to break down these gender stereotypes and allow everyone to contribute for the good of organizations and families, and really for all of our societies.
Mm-hmm. I love what you said there about how this is something that's very cultural, even. So just relating it to the acquiescence part that Amy talked about. Here in the Philippines, for example, it's very common for the like older people to say to the younger people, especially to women, that you should try figuring out when you'll get married, because once you have kids, you have to stop work or take a step back in the work that you're doing, whatever that may be. Like, this is something that is very common we would hear. So I think those kinds of cultural influences, they really seep into the different conversations, the different advice that sometimes even senior mentors who are women would give that advice to younger women in the workplace. So I mean, they mean well, but these are just some of the beliefs that have gone on from generation to generation. That's why they still exist. I think it's great that we talk about it, because then we question what these might be, right? Yeah. So maybe it might be good to shift into some examples, right? When we talk about beliefs, perception, behaviors, it sounds very theoretical. It sounds like it's something you just study in school. But do you have any examples of actual maybe work you've done with like a company or an organization, and what were the positive outcomes that you saw when they started to be more inclusive, when they started treating women more equally?
So Leanne and I recently worked with the leaders of an innovation department at a governmental organization here in the United States. This group was diverse. It was women, men, and then there was a transgender individual, and they were of differing races and ethnicities. The thing about this group was that they were really committed. They committed themselves to understanding gender bias and to learning how they could make change. And so what we did working with this group is we scheduled a series of workshops that were scheduled weekly over the period of about a month. And through the workshops, these leaders were able to better identify bias, and then learn what they were learning was how to interrupt it, and how to also consider what approaches they needed to take to rid bias from their processes, their procedures, and their everyday work. And we talked about these things through the course of the workshops. There was lots of good discussion. But the key here was that it was the leaders of the organization that were involved in the in these workshops. It wasn't, while we speak to all people at all levels, it wasn't just the people at the bottom, who were the ones being, feeling the effects maybe of the bias. It was the people who were in charge and who could make change. And not only that, each person was committed to making change. And they also recognized, one of the things we discussed with them was they recognized how change takes time. It doesn't, any kind of culture change, organization change, it doesn't happen overnight. And it's important to understand that. And they also understood how it's actually a journey. So it's like a step-by-step process. Again, it's none of this, it didn't start overnight. It's not going to end overnight. But through the workshops, like I said, they were interactive, and what they got to do was plan the next steps that they would be using to create a gender equitable department. And then what they've done since Leanne and I's time with them is they had made a commitment to continue their work internally. So they were having internal meetings without us to continue to talk about what they had learned and how they could apply it to their workplace. Mm-hmm. So in our book, one of the things that we provide is a gender equity and inclusion roadmap. And I'm going to share my screen with you again because I want to show you the image of this roadmap. So in our book, after we describe all of the six primary glass walls, the primary barriers, and we break them down into all the subcomponents, we have a chapter where we talk to organizational leaders about how to rid your organization of gender bias, and we present this roadmap. So what organization and HR leaders can do is assess where you're currently sitting on the roadmap, and we talk through each level in the book, and then you can make strategies to move up through the levels. So it starts at the bottom from what we call avoiding or gender blind. That's an organization that just really doesn't even think about it or consider that gender bias is an issue. And it goes all the way up to a sustainable culture, a gender equitable and inclusive culture. So most organizations are likely not starting from the bottom. Many countries and many in the United States, many states have compliance that people that organizations rules that organizations must follow. So a lot of people are at least at the compliant level. But like I said, through the book, you can read about each level, assess where you are, and then work on moving up. As I said, it's a step-by-step process. Like you're not going to go from level 0 to level 5 overnight, but you can assess where you are, and then we offer steps in the book for how you can go from level 0 to 1, 1 to 2, 2 to 3, etc., all the way up to fully sustainable.
That's what makes it hard, right? Like it's a step-by-step process, and it takes a lot of time. So it's hard to see results. And I think sometimes that's why for HR professionals, it's difficult to get into DEI, because you cannot show tangible results in a snap like other projects maybe that you might do. So and I love though that there's a visual we can kind of look at as a guide as we try to take those steps. So for here, I hope you were listening as Amy was talking, because she said something there that is very interesting. So Amy said that in the work she did with that organization, the workshops helped them to interrupt their bias. So please, I hope we pay attention to that, because when we try to do DEI initiatives, it's not about telling people to zero bias, like take away the biases in your brain, because sometimes you don't even know that you have a bias for something. Sometimes they're unconscious. But what we want to do is to have these initiatives that will help people to be more aware, so they can interrupt their biases before they say something or do something that might be harmful to others, right? So that's really the goal of having webinars and sessions like this, so we can keep on talking about them and increase that awareness, help you to interrupt those biases when you see them or when you're starting to think about them. All right, so now that we have like a big picture or some basics in terms of what we can do, let's go to Leanne. Because Leanne, you've seen that in the data I shared earlier. Here in the Philippines, it seems like we're doing pretty well in terms of how we rank globally. I think we're even higher than some Western countries. So, something to be proud of for the Philippines. But what else can we do? Like, how else can we address gender bias at work, especially when people might say, well, you're already high enough. What more do you want, right?
Yeah, we're really glad to hear how well you are doing. It is encouraging to see that you have good representation and are ranking second in your region. That's fantastic. And as we've seen, it's not enough, right? So some of the ways, in our book, we talk about some of the ways that women and leaders and allies can work to interrupt and dismantle these different pieces of gender bias in the workplace. And so we ask questions like, how can you amplify women's voices in work? Or how can you move from tokenism when there's only perhaps one woman on a team and she's just there to represent all women? How can you move from that tokenism to really full representation of women's ideas and women's perspectives at work? Or how can you better support women in the workplace? That whole chapter on insufficient support just points out all the ways where women go to work and don't have the same resources or opportunities or provisions that men just sort of take for granted and have available to them. So how can you better support women? And maybe at the same time, better encourage men to be more involved at home, because it's a synergistic problem, right? If men are completely abandoning the home, then the women are going to feel like they have to take it all on. And so we need to work on both sides of the equation. And those are the kinds of questions that we hope you're asking and that we try to help you ask or learn to ask in the book. Because again, we need names for things. We need to recognize it when it happens, and we need to know how to stop it or interrupt it and stop from just sliding into that unconscious, unthinking way of acting that we've always had.
Mm-hmm. I love that suggestion about also getting men more involved even at home. So I actually, I'm also an executive coach, and I coached this person before. He's male, so very senior level, a regional director. And what he was struggling with was that he was feeling like he wants to be a better father to his children who are becoming teenagers, growing older as adults. And then what he was saying was he felt so alone because at work he would see the other females just so openly and easily talk about their kids and like what they did with their kids over the weekend, etc. But for him, it was like the other guys don't really join the conversation. So at work, like even during lunch, he felt like there was no one he could talk to about how much he loves his kids and loves being a father. So I think those are things that definitely we have to pay attention to those kinds of conversations at work. So Amy, going with that conversation about how to get men involved, right? Are there any tips or strategies that you can give so we can get even the men or any other gender more involved in terms of gender inclusion?
Yeah, we love this question because it is so important to get the men on board with, and people of all genders on board with this conversation, as it takes everyone working together to overcome this pernicious problem of workplace gender bias. While gender bias is it's obviously so harmful to women's lives and careers, men should also understand that it's equally as harmful to their own lives and careers. And one of the participants mentioned that in the Menti, I noticed that it's not only is gender bias harmful to women, it's harmful to men too. Mm-hmm. So preventing women from contributing equally at work, it causes a few things. One, it thwarts solutions to societal problems. It precludes organizations from truly thriving. And it keeps men locked into unhelpful gender stereotypes, limited perspectives, and rigid work requirements. So in the book, we tell the story of biochemist Dr. 𝗟𝗏 𝗏𝗃. You may have heard of her. She was instrumental in the development of the mRNA COVID vaccine. Dr. Carrico encountered significant gender bias when she was doing her original mRNA research at the University of Pennsylvania in the mid-90s and the early 2000s. Yet she persisted, and her work set the foundation for the fast development of the first COVID-19 vaccines. And so while Dr. Carrico persevered, I think about how much more successful would she have been if she had just been supported at work and doing her job, if she just hadn't encountered the many barriers that she encountered. So due to gender bias and discrimination, many women, though, are held back from their potential influence or forced to drop out of the workforce altogether. And we can't even imagine the losses to society that the things that we don't have because women have been held back or forced out. And it becomes all of society's loss, including men's. And so while to answer your question, while it shouldn't be our jobs as women to educate every man, helping them understand why gender equity and inclusion helps them both personally and organizationally is important. So we'd certainly recommend handing them a copy of Glass Walls, handing them a copy of this book, and asking them to read it. We have got so many strategies in our book that men can implement as allies. Every single chapter, at the end of the chapter, we provide strategies for leaders, for the women themselves, and for allies. So that there's a section that they can take no matter what level they're at in the organization that the men can take and combat the specific barriers that we described. So some things are simple, like watching out when women are interrupted, like if they're talking in a meeting and they're interrupted, or if their ideas are being stolen stolen in a meeting, if someone else is taking credit for them. They can watch out for those kinds of things and redirect the conversation back to the woman who gave the idea or who was speaking. And they can make sure that the woman gets credit. Other ideas are like just to be a sounding board for women who are experiencing gender bias, just being a safe space and a safe person to talk to, and then being an advocate for women. Suggesting women for hiring, suggesting specific women for promotions. There are many ways. There's so many ways that men can help. So no matter their role or level in the organization, there's so many things that men can do. And like we said, we outline lots of different strategies for men, for allies in our book.
Yeah, it's more effective, right? If more people get involved and not just women or one specific gender. I do workshops on DEI with different companies, and I think some of the men that I've talked to, they said that they appreciate it when they're asked questions that are usually just asked for women, right? So for example, if you ask them, how are you feeling, versus like, what do you think about what happened yesterday? So sometimes like very simple prompts like that help them to remember that, okay, like I can actually share, I can actually talk about these things and take part in these kinds of conversations that are usually not for men that we think about in the workplace. So lots of good suggestions there. Bringing it back to HR specifically though, Leanne, if we think about HR professionals, are there specific things that maybe we should be doing, we should prioritize and focus on in terms of gender inclusion?
That's a great question. In our book, we do outline these 6 different major barriers that Amy's already explained, but what to prioritize is really going to depend on what is happening in any given organization, right? So Amy has talked a little bit about how to diagnose the gender equity and inclusion level of the organization using that roadmap, that stair step. And so you can take that tool, and in the book we talk about another tool that we have developed, which is a scale that organizations can use to actually measure what's going on in these 6 areas at work. And then if you use that scale, HR professionals can identify which particular barrier or barriers are really the most pressing needs in the organization for addressing, and then start there. So Amy's website links to the scale. And we recognize that every organization may need to prioritize a different spot as a starting place. And that's fine. There's no right place to start. There's no wrong place to start. the most important thing really is to just do something. Don't do nothing. That would be the worst outcome.
Right. I think it's very important here to note that for HR professionals, there's an added responsibility of data and having those kinds of like very tangible like numbers that you can show. So something I always advise to my clients, for example, is when it comes to DEI work, you don't just talk about how people will feel safer or feel happier at work. Like you have to show the numbers of where are we in terms of representation, or how do you know that these are the issues happening in your company and relating that with DEI. So I love that we have a scale that we could try, and I'll share Amy's website in the chat. Sorry, Amy.
I was just going to add the scale. The name of the scale is the Gender Bias Scale for Women Leaders. It was developed by myself, Dr. Dubinsky, and two other researchers, Dr. Amber Stevenson and Dr. David Long. And it is on my website. Elisha just shared the link. But that was really our goal, was to give organizations a way to measure and have data, rather than just having like maybe anecdotal stories. Not that there's nothing wrong with anecdotal stories, nothing wrong with people's stories. There's nothing wrong with qualitative data. In fact, Leanne and I are qualitative researchers. But like you say, sometimes you also need the quantitative to go along with it. And so that's why we developed the scale, and the scale does measure, it measures these six gender bias barriers. This is what the scale measures. And it will give you, if you use the scale across a group of women, it will give you results based on these six primary factors that I just described. So we think it's really a really useful tool. The other thing that's nice about the tool is that if you're an individual woman and you think you've been experiencing bias, you're not sure, you can actually read the scale questions and get a sense for what types of things you might be experiencing. The scale wasn't designed to be scored on an individual level. It's really designed to be scored across a group, but any individual, it can be really helpful for an individual woman to read the scale questions and just get an idea of how bias may be impacting her.
Great. And thank you so much, Amy and Leanne, for sharing about that scale. I encourage all of you here to please take advantage of that. That's why we invite authors and actual researchers to these kinds of webinars, because of course, practitioners are great. Like we love hearing about their stories and their policies, but it's not always that we get researchers with scales and the different tools that we can use to diagnose what's going on. So please take advantage of that and make sure to go to Amy's website to check that scale. So Leanne, Amy, thank you so much for answering my questions and telling us more about these glass walls that are holding women back at work. Thank you for exploring with us like the different mindsets and different cultural, societal influences maybe that influence our work and the way our work environments. So everyone, please, we are now open for questions. If you have a question for Amy or Leanne, you can unmute, raise your hand, and I'll call you. Then you can ask them your question, or you could also type it in the chat and I'll read it for you. If you're shy, you can send it to me privately as well, okay? So please go ahead and start doing that. We do have some questions that we already got, so I'll go ahead and read them for you. Okay, so the first question is, I'm a woman who is passed over for promotions all the time. Why are men preferred for top ranks, and what do I do? So it's a little bit more personal, but maybe you have some advice that you can share.
Leanne, do you want to take it, or do you want me to take it?
It's a complex question. Go ahead, Amy, and then I'll tag on.
Okay. All right. Well, first of all, I'm very sorry. This has happened to so many of us, where we are passed over for promotions, and we see men who maybe aren't even working as hard as us who are getting the promotion. And what we find that again, we talked about that first barrier, that male privilege, where men are seen as the leaders. Men are the ones who, you have a man and a woman, they're maybe equally qualified or not equally qualified, but due to stereotypes, the man is perceived to have the potential to do the job. Often men are given advantages and opportunities based on their perceived potential just because they're men, and not really based on anything. So, you know, as far as things that you can do, I mean, I think that's like the $1 million question, and that's the thing that we all want to know. And so first thing I'll say before I answer any questions about what can I do, what can I do as an individual woman do, just understand that it's not women's responsibility to fix the problem of gender bias. It really is organizational leaders' responsibility to make their workplaces gender equitable and inclusive. But you know, things that you want to make sure that you're doing is, you know, first of all, I would say making sure that you've got like a good support network around you. You want to make sure that you've got people around you, mentors, sponsors, both inside of your organization and outside of your organization. So you want to make sure that you've got people to talk to who can give you advice specific to your situation, and can give you, you know, information and suggestions based on their own experience, and also can, like, the whole sponsor thing is good, because if you find somebody who you can connect with who's at a higher level position, they can help, you know, create openings for you. But you just want to make sure that you've got a good support network around you, again, inside and outside of your organization. And you want to also make sure that, like, when you're, again, the whole thing about women not getting credit, you know, you're in a meeting and you say something, and it's maybe ignored, and then the man, you know, who's in the meeting, in the Zoom meeting or the in-person meeting, you know, says the same thing, and he gets the credit. And you know, that's always a tricky one, right? Like, what do you do whenever, you know, your idea is, and we call this actually has a name. It's one of the things that didn't have a label, or that had a label that wasn't well known, that we have talked about in the book. It's called heap-eating. So when a woman says something and it's ignored, and a man says the same thing and everyone loves it. But you want, yeah, thank you for typing that into the chat, Leanne. You want to make sure that if you feel comfortable to say, you know, interrupt that in the meeting and say, hey, I just said that, like, and try to get the conversation back to you. Or another thing about the support network is having colleagues, having a buddy that can watch for that kind of thing happening, so they can say, hey, Amy just said that. Let's hear more what she has to say. Mm-hmm. So those are just a few tips. Like, certainly we've got many more tips in the book. And Leanne, I'll turn it over to you in case you want to add on to anything that I've just said there.
Yeah, I think one message that is really important that Amy and I want to give is, it's so many of us women are acculturated to thinking that when we're told, oh, you didn't get that because that reason is true. And a lot of times it's just an excuse because they actually wanted the man. And so we really, really want to encourage women not to self-blame, not to take it personally, and not to try to change yourself to fit the situation. And so the only thing I would add to everything, really good things that Amy has said, is that it's okay sometimes to move on. Like, if that happened to you once, I wouldn't say leave the company. But if it's a pattern that's been happening over and over and over again, where you're getting passed over and you're not getting traction, maybe it is okay to look around and find a healthier place for you. Because we women, we do tend to internalize this and we take it personally, and it can be very damaging if it's going on for a long time.
Yeah, that's right. And our last chapter in our book is called, it's aimed towards women, and it's called Taking Charge of Your Own Success. And it's really, what do you do when you encounter barriers and obstacles, any kind of adversity? But what do you do when you encounter gender bias? And like Leanne said, we never tell you, we're not telling you how that you shouldn't take it personally, but also we don't tell you to change anything that's unique about you. We don't tell you how to dress or how to, you know, use what tone of voice to use or anything like that. But we do give you research-based strategies for how to overcome any type of adversity, which includes gender bias. And actually the final one that we talk about is what Leanne just mentioned, is having alternatives. And when you're just running into barriers, you're running into barrier after barrier after barrier in that same company or with that same person, think about what your alternatives are. Don't keep beating your head against the wall.
Great. That's such an important point, that it's not you who has to change all the time, right? Like, it's a systemic problem. So I'm sure, like, for a lot of women, you've been told like, oh, your voice is a little bit too high, which is something that some people have told me before, or like, oh, don't talk like that because no one will take you seriously. But really, like, I've found teams and organizations that it didn't matter how you talk, as long as you're professional enough, right? As long as you carry yourself well and you speak clearly, like, that's all that matters. And I love that reminder of, you don't have to change like your tone or your voice. It's not about you taking all that for yourself. We have a second question that we actually got from our registration form, which I think is a great question. So I'd love to ask this from both of you and get your thoughts on it. So the question is, how will you manage a female boss who is micromanaging and bossy? I don't want to use those words, but she's had multiple complaints about attitude. Very tricky, right? Because we all know that women are more likely to be called bossy, and that's something that makes people not see them as leaders. But what do you do in this case if there's actually like a repeated attitude problem with that female boss?
I can start on that one.
Yeah, go ahead.
We have a section in our book about this because it's so counterintuitive that another woman is being difficult rather than supportive, and yet we hear about it and we see about it. And so we actually have some words for it. And when it's your boss, it's often thought of as a queen bee. And it's really, really easy to blame this particular woman and say, oh, it's her fault, she's this, she's that. But we think that that's not a helpful response or a helpful attitude, because first of all, she's working in the same system that you are, the same system we all are in, and we've all been socialized into this belief that men should be the ones who are in charge. And so she may be actually feeling really insecure. And so this micromanaging may be coming out of insecurity that she feels that she's got to show the perfect work to whoever her boss is. It may be insecurity that if she doesn't perform well enough, they'll take this job away from her because maybe there's only room for one woman, right? And so one of the strategies that we suggest in the book is to try to get to know her as a human. Attempt, if you can, to sit down with her over coffee or tea or whatever's appropriate in your context and build a little human connection and find out what's going on with her, because maybe there are ways you can actually support each other rather than feeling like you're at odds with each other. It might not work. It doesn't always work, but sometimes it works and it's worth a try.
Yeah, and I'll say too that it's like that is like that's always our first go-to approach. And in fact, I've run into this problem quite a few times in my own experience, and where I had women that were blocking me and making my work life challenging and difficult. And I really, especially when I was young, I really did not understand. Because I thought we're all here for the same goal. Like, we're trying to advance this organization, but yet you're blocking me, you're standing in my way, and I'm just trying to get my job done, you know? And so yeah, this approach of like Leanne said, of trying to get to know this woman personally, you know, trying to connect over like, you know, coffee, tea, lunch, you know, asking her about her family, her vacations, her hobbies, you know, things outside of work, so that you make this human connection. And then also expressing your desire to have a positive relationship, work relationship with her, but, you know, for the benefit of the organization, is a good thing to do. And as Leanne said, it doesn't work with everyone. I mean, I'll be the first to admit it doesn't work with every woman. It does work with some, and I have used this approach, and I have improved my relationships with a few people, a few women who had started out much more negatively, but I've improved my relationships using this approach. But it goes back to then, if it doesn't help, it goes back then to what we just talked about, is having alternatives, especially when it's your boss. It can be really difficult. And if your boss is not supporting you, and you've tried to correct the problem, you've tried to rectify the problem, you can really just be left in a tough position. And so that's where you really want to look at your alternatives. Is there another position in your same organization that you could apply for? Is there another position in another organization that you could apply for? Could you go back to school and learn a different, different type of skill? Could you work for yourself? If you're running into with your boss, this kind of, we talk about also in the book, just unsupportive leadership as one of the barriers. But if it's your boss, it can be really, really challenging, because that's the person that really has the most control and say over your role in the organization. So it's important that you try to make things right, try to do your best, give it that good effort, and multiple attempts, to make things right. But if you're just running into roadblocks with that person, then do think about what your options are.
Right, so very layered question, but hopefully the person who asked it was able to get some tips from that sharing. All right, so next up, we have a question from a college student, and I think they are studying this concept of gender and bias. That's why they have questions here. So from this person, they were wondering about the concepts of like visibility that leads to women being pressured to perform, assimilation and how it traps people to certain roles, and then how polarization could also lead people to like feeling isolated in the maybe advocacies they're trying to push for. Are these kinds of issues also glass walls, would you say, that women are facing at work?
Can you say the 3 key terms again?
Yeah.
Because
Yes. So they said visibility leading to pressure to perform, assimilation that leads people to being trapped in their roles as the woman at work, and then also like having polarized opinions that lead people to like feeling isolated in the different advocacies they push for.
Well, it's interesting because I was just going to say these 3 things remind me of, if we really think about tokenism, and which we talk about in the book, and what tokenism results in, and it's that heightened visibility, but also that isolation. And so, yes, it fits very well. Like, we have a section on tokenism. Tokenism is a form of male privilege, the first barrier that we talked about. So we do talk about this in the book, and it fits right into this gendered framework. And Leanne, sorry, I interrupted you.
Okay, and the only other thing I was thinking of was scrutiny. This feeling that you're constantly being examined and scrutinized, everything from what you wear to how you perform at work, and the heightened pressure and expectation that comes from that sort of feeling like you're always under the magnifying glass. And that is a form of bias, and it's not fair, because it's putting pressure on women to perform at a different level in a different way than men doing the same job.
Yep. Yes. So hopefully that helps you make the connection there. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Amy.
I was just gonna say, scrutiny is a type of disproportionate constraint, which was the second barrier that we talked about. And we have a whole section on scrutiny in the book too.
Yep. Great. Yep. So hopefully that will help you see the connections between, maybe you're studying the tokenism research at this point. So yeah, so these are related to glass walls that Amy and Leanne talked about. All right, so we have a question from the chat. Do you think having more women in managerial positions could help in addressing some concerns in gender? So maybe it's, what are your thoughts on that?
You want me to take it, or you want to take it, Leanne?
It's a yes and no. So why don't you do the yes and I'll do the no?
I'll start. Well, I'll start. We wrote an article for Harvard Business Review, Leanne and I, along with Dr. Amber Stevenson. And it was about why, or it was our research about why, basically, why adding women and stirring is not enough to fix the problem of gender bias. And this shout out to Leanne. Leanne brought in that term to the article, the add women and stirring approach. Just adding women is not enough. And what we found in our research, we had looked at 4 female-dominated or either gender-balanced or female-dominated industries. They were medicine, like healthcare, law, higher education, and faith-based nonprofits. So all of these organizations have equal or numbers of women and men in them, or more women than men. Like healthcare, for example, has like way more women than men if you look at the organization overall. But what we found in our research is, even though these industries were gender balanced or female dominated, they were the women who were in management roles, in leadership roles, we're still experiencing lots and lots of gender bias. And the different we were assessing was these different 6 factors, the different forms of gender bias that they were experiencing. So to answer your question, just add women in stirring is not enough. It really takes creating an inclusive workplace, which is again what we talk about in our book, how leaders can do that.
Great, thank you. And before I move to the next question, so the college student who just asked the question, they said that they're considering this as a focal subject for their thesis in the future. So thank you so much for explaining. That's what they said. Okay, so next question. Either Amy or Leanne, what are some common mistakes that HR professionals make when it comes to addressing gender bias in the workplace? And how can they avoid these mistakes?
Yeah, that's a good one. That's one to think about.
That's not really one we study.
Certainly thinking about it simplistically would be one thing to not do. Like we talk about, it's a journey. It's not like one mistake that organizations make is they have a training or a workshop on gender bias. And we think training on gender bias is good. It is a good first step. Everybody needs to learn about it, know what it is, and know how to recognize it. But the mistake they make is when they stop there. They have a workshop, they have a training, and they say, okay, good, we're all trained on gender bias. We all have had this one hour workshop. We're all good. That's all we need to do. The mistake there is stopping there. That's really just the very, very first step. Because after you have that, initial workshop where you get people kind of socialized with, what is gender bias, what behaviors make up gender bias, what types of processes are inherently biased. Then the next steps are, how do you move your organization how do you systemically move your organization from one that it has, all this embedded gender bias to become a gender equitable and inclusive organization. So that's probably the biggest mistake, or the most frequent mistake that I see organizations making, is just, again, wanting just to invest, in the training and then do nothing more.
Or another way to think about it is, if you're only doing compliance, if you're only meeting what your country or your state or your region requires, then that's not going to be enough. That's not going to bring any real or lasting change, and it's not going to bring any real or lasting benefit to the organization.
Yep. Yeah, I would have to echo those mistakes. I think this is also something I see when you would do like an event for Women's Month, and then that's it, right? Like nothing more concrete comes out of it. Or maybe just to add to that, I see some companies, especially the more Asian companies, I would say, where if you have a training on diversity and inclusion, their leaders would just give the opening remarks, and then the HR professional will just allow the leader to leave after that, because they've done their opening remarks, and no one wants to tell them you have to stay and do this workshop as well. So I think that's something we have to do, right? Even leaders have to take the workshop.
Well, leaders have to lead, and we one of the messages in our book, and one of the things we mentioned here earlier, you can't just train the people at the bottom of the organization who are lower in the hierarchy. That's not where organizational change happens at all levels, but it's most effective when it starts from the top and is sustained from the top.
So everyone, I know I got a lot of questions, and I'm so sorry I cannot read them all, but we have our last 2 questions, okay, that I'll be addressing to Amy and Leanne. Let's go with Leanne first. I think this might be a question that you'd have some good tips to share. So the person says, our leaders in the company don't pay much attention to gender/women/LGBTQIA issues because they are devout in their religion. Your thoughts on this? There wasn't any specific question, but maybe your thoughts.
Yeah, that is interesting, and I've run into it before. Typically, unfortunately, in that case, you really do, the thing that gets you in the door, in my experience, is the business case. They're not going to be interested in the moral case because they already have moral grounds for trying to argue that it doesn't matter. And so the way in is usually going to be through the business case and the bottom line, and why the company is going to be more profitable, more successful, do better in the market, have fewer complaints, whatever it is, that's the kind of thing that will get their attention. It's going to have to be super practical.
Yeah. Very, very difficult, right? Just to share with you, Leanne, here in the Philippines, we're predominantly Catholic, and then also lots of people who are Christian and of the Muslim religion. So I get where that question is coming from, that religion definitely plays a part in organizations. All right. So, yep. Thank you, Leanne. And then our last question for Amy. Amy, this person says, I'm a recruiter in a male-dominated industry, just like where you are. And even if I want to hire women, it's hard for me to find them. Not enough women apply in my male-dominated industry. What tips can help with this?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I have experience with this question, working in male-dominated field of IT. And there are a couple tips that I can think of. The first place you want to start is looking at your job advertisements, making sure that there's not gender bias hidden in the advertisements. And we give some examples of this in the book. There was an organization that I came across and doing my research that talked about in their job advertisements about how their organization had a work hard, play hard attitude, and how in the afternoons they would have Nerf gun fights. Nerf gun battles, like in their open office environment. And I thought, who is that really speaking to? You know, I think they're trying to hire, a particular demographic, like young men, right? Sure, there's some women that would love to participate in Nerf gun battles, but in general, that's kind of a young male kind of a activity. And so you really want to look at like words like competitive, like that's another word that can indicate that there's some bias in your ads, that women should not apply. There's much more inclusive words like teamwork, cooperative environment, supportive, that you want to make sure they're in your advertisement. So that's one thing. The second thing is to recognize that there was a study that showed that if you have a set of minimum job expectations or job qualifications for your job in an ad, a man will apply if he meets like 50% of them. A woman will apply only if she meets like 100%, right? And so that keeps women from applying. So you really want to think in your advertisement, what are really, really the bare minimum qualifications that a person needs to have, so that you're not inadvertently excluding a portion of your potential applicants. Then the thing that I have used in my own experience is to go and recruit specific women for roles in your company. And sometimes you may have like I work in higher ed, and we fortunately work with a lot of we'll have like a lot of student workers we would have a lot of student workers in our IT department, which included like men and women. And what I was able to do for certain entry-level full-time jobs was say to some of the women student workers, hey, did you think about applying for this? Like to just try to go to give them that extra encouragement. And suggest that, yeah, we think that you could be a good fit, and just really to go just go make that personal connection with someone. Because like we said, a woman may look at that your ad and think, no, that looks like it's too much. It's like, I don't think I could do this. But if you can really just identify, particular women that you see that have potential, and encourage them to apply. So those are a few tips. I could probably go on with more and talk about it for a while longer, but I'll stop there.
For sure. I think building those relationships with even the colleges, right, might be a good thing to do also, because if you get them to be interested in it, then maybe that's where your pipeline can come from. So yeah, Amy, Leanne, thank you so much for our conversation. Thank you for answering all of the questions from our participants. We loved having you here, even if it's almost night. It's nighttime for you and almost time to sleep, but it's been great learning from you. Any last words or final messages before we say goodbye?
Well, I'll share my screen again. I'll just want to mention where you can pick up our book. Our book is available for pre-order now. And it's at all the major online resellers. I've got on my website, amy-deal.com/book, I've got links to the major online resellers. And I understand that in the Philippines, Amazon is
Yes.
the usual place to find.
I would say use the Amazon link because
Use the
they
Amazon
deliver to
link.
the Philippines.
Yeah, so the Amazon link is one of the links on my website, but like we said, you can pre-order now, and go ahead and get a pre-order, so that way it will arrive as soon as it's released in June. So I wanted to share that with you, and I want to thank you for having us. This has been a really insightful conversation, and we so appreciate hearing your experiences. We are US based, but we so appreciate hearing your experiences from the Philippines. And really, when it boils down to it, like we're all women, like all as women, we're all experiencing the same things. It's a global phenomenon. So Leanne, I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, no, I just echo that. Thank you. We're so happy to be here with you. It's great to know that you care about these things and you're interested in these things. And it sort of makes me feel like I'm part of a global sisterhood. So I really appreciate it.
For sure. Global sisterhood, and not just women, right? We have men here as well and people from all genders. So I'm glad that we're all together in pushing for this.
I can't think of an inclusive enough term for us, but a global community.
Yes, for sure. But,
yeah.
All right, Amy, Leanne, thank you so much for being here. We'll let you go to sleep. Maybe in the future, if you're in the Philippines, we can see you in person and all going to get together. But everyone, please say thank you and bye and good night to Amy and Leanne. Show them some love from the Philippines. Thank you so much for being with us on a Thursday afternoon. If you want a picture with our guests here, you can go ahead and turn your cameras on. But if you don't want to be part of the picture, it's okay if you leave. I know it's almost lunchtime. Enjoy your lunch and enjoy the rest of the week.